Today we're going to continue our regional tour through the classical period. So as a reminder, we are covering the classical period in history, region by region, not necessarily in perfect chronological order. So we already looked at the Persian Empire, and today we're going to be moving east to look at the Han Dynasty in China, before eventually making it over to India to look at a couple of golden ages there. As always, if you are currently in my class, please pause the video and take notes if you see a red arrow at the top right of the screen that tells you to take notes. We started our look at classical Asia in 550 BCE with the Persian Empire, established by Cyrus the Great. In terms of our unit-long question, what's the best way to rule the world, the classical world in this case? Persia starts to give us some answers. And those answers are really the legacy of Cyrus and Darius, both known to history as the Great. Persia was able to rule a giant territory through policies of tolerance, which means they allowed conquered people to keep their beliefs and traditions as long as they paid tribute, because the resources, the tribute tax money, that was really the whole point of empire to begin with. And if you allow people to keep their cultures and traditions, they tend not to hate you as much, which makes ruling over them a little bit easier. We saw also that Persia implemented a really efficient bureaucracy, so a system of provinces and governors and tax collectors to gather that all-important tribute. And with that money, they built some pretty impressive infrastructure to continue to hold their empire. They developed a postal service. They built the Royal Road, famously for communication, not just communication though, to be able to move an army easily, to be able to trade easily. Roads are really the lifeblood of empires, and Persia shows us that. They also built canals, which are man-made waterways. All of this stuff made the empire run more efficiently, and tribute money, stuff that we're taking from people that we conquered, pays for it. Persia also saw that standardization was the key to rule. The more you can get your conquered territory to be speaking the same language, to use the same coins, the same weights and measurements, the easier it is to run that empire. The Persian story will end down the line with Xerxes the not so great spending a ton of money to fail to conquer Greece. And then later, Persia will be conquered by Alexander, known to history as the Great. We will see him later on in the unit. So today we're going to jump in time all the way to 206 BCE over here on the top right of the screen to look at the Han Dynasty in China, the classical civilization of China that existed for about 400 years that offers some different answers to how to rule the classical world. The Han Dynasty in China was the major classical civilization to exist in Eastern Asia, and it really provided China with a period of stability and peace in which many innovations and some pretty important philosophies, notably Confucianism, took root. First, a little background on China, and this you definitely don't have to write down, just kind of have a listen. The history of China starts in the Yellow River Valley, a river valley civilization, where fertile land was scarce, and so terrace farming, specifically to cultivate rice, was the way that people survived. It was first ruled by a line of kings called the Shang. They ruled for a while, and then the Zhao, a semi-barbarous people that the Shang had looked down on up to that point, eventually conquered and took over. The Zhao brought to China a really key idea that would lend legitimacy and stability to politics long after the Zhao regime was over, and that idea was called the Mandate of Heaven. The idea is this: no one rules the earth without the mandate or the consent of heaven. Heaven being a supreme being who rules the cosmos in sort of a vague kind of way. So if you are a ruler on earth, it is because heaven has blessed you. If you lose your power on earth, it's because you have lost the blessing of heaven, the mandate of heaven, and you're supposed to be replaced. According to this line of thinking, the Zhao didn't take over for glory or for riches or for all of the other reasons that people tend to take over stuff. but rather because heaven had commanded them to punish the Shang for eventually becoming corrupt and ruling badly. Under this idea, the people should obey their rulers, and rulers have to rule justly or fairly in order to keep their right to rule. If they don't, if they're not good rulers, they will lose the mandate of heaven to another king who can prove he successfully has won the mandate just by the fact that he has successfully taken over. So if I am king, I have the mandate of heaven. If you take over and I'm not king anymore, it's because I've lost the mandate of heaven. This idea became a really significant way that the Chinese viewed history for a really long time. The rise and fall of dynasties, so ruling families, as they gain and eventually lose the mandate of heaven, is how a lot of the imperial history of this time period is narrated. So the Zhao gave us a really, really key idea that will outlive the Zhao regime, the mandate of heaven. They lost the mandate of heaven at some point to another group called the Qin. The Qin were the first to unite all of China under a single ruling family, which is called a dynasty, during which time a fourth of the people on Earth were in China. So it was always a really populous part of the world. This dynasty began the Great Wall, famously, to keep out raiding horsemen from the Asian grasslands. And this story about Asian horsemen raiding China from the grasslands beyond the border is going to be a repeated theme, not just in this early part of Chinese history, but also in the Han Dynasty as well. So we arrive at our key points. The Han Dynasty was the ruling empire in China. A dynasty is a family line that has power. Right, so it's like an empire, except that everybody who rules that empire belongs to the same family. The Han Dynasty took a really structured and, for the time period, unique approach to ruling this vast territory efficiently and effectively, such that it could have about a 400-year period of relative stability. And the keys to this rule are all vocabulary words that you need to know. So the first is centralization, central being a really important root word. Centralization means that power is held by a central government or one person, the emperor, centrally. And in the case of the Han Dynasty, it was legitimized by this idea of the mandate of heaven, the idea that the ruler is blessed by heaven to rule, and when heaven favors someone else, the ruler will change. Because people believed this idea, it gave the ruling family a lot of power. Just because they were ruling meant that they had the mandate of heaven. And centralization was really key to keeping a big civilization organized, because if you have centralized authority, you only have one person making decisions, so they can make the same decision for the whole territory. It reduces some disputes. It's pretty great if your central ruler is wise and makes good decisions. It's pretty not great if your centralized ruler makes terrible decisions, as we will see later on. Second, the Han Dynasty agreed with Persia that the key to centralized rule was a healthy bureaucracy. Remember, bureaucracy comes from the French word desk. That's why it's impossible to spell. And it refers to that layer of government officials and administrators with authority to do things like collect taxes, keep records, administer government exams, like do the work of government, but without any authority themselves to make laws or to make decisions. They can just really implement the law for the ruler. So the Han Dynasty's bureaucracy was pretty great and pretty functional and unique because of the way that they chose their bureaucrats. We could think of it as a meritocracy. The key word in meritocracy is to merit, to earn something. It refers to a system of choosing leadership based on merit, skill, rather than like privilege or wealth or loyalty to the ruler or whatever else. The Han Dynasty used an exam system to pick who was going to be in the bureaucracy. You had to qualify for it. If you were going to be a tax collector, you had to show that you could actually do that. So Through this system, the Han Dynasty ensured that the most educated, the most qualified people were in charge of doing the work of government, which made things run relatively smoothly. So over here on the right of the slide, you can kind of see a diagram of how that would work. Centrally, a king would give orders, and the bureaucrats in all of these different provinces or regions would carry out those orders. Because the Han Dynasty had a meritocratic bureaucracy, these bureaucrats that were carrying out these orders, like this little dude over here, would have had to pass a test and qualify for their position. So they would have been pretty good at what they did. And so the Han Dynasty developed this culture of like wisdom and knowledge and the scholar government official that was pretty influential. So what's the best way to rule the world? We ask. The Han Dynasty would say centralization and a meritocratic bureaucracy. Remembering that the emperor had the mandate of heaven, and that was what like made the whole system hum along and gave him legitimacy according to the eyes of the people he ruled. So what did the Han Dynasty do with these 400 years of relative stability? Turns out a whole lot. The Han Dynasty pioneered a bunch of inventions that would individually run on to change history in different ways. Paper, the suspension bridge, a wheelbarrow, a seismograph to detect earthquakes. That one's pictured on the bottom left of the slide, and I think it looks really cool. They were able to make blast furnaces to make cast iron way earlier than like in Europe. Cast iron's really important because it's a really strong metal. Stirrups for horses were actually really key to a lot of the military technology that came after. Have you ever tried to ride a horse? It's hard, even with stirrups. Try riding a horse without stirrups and then try shooting an arrow at something and actually hitting what you mean to hit. Please don't actually try this, but you kind of get the idea. Stirrups are really, really key to making horses usable, not just in everyday life, but also in conquest with increasingly elaborate weapons. They came up with a rudder to steer ships without using oars, a seed drill to better, more efficiently plant seeds that would grow into food, and a chain pump to make irrigation easier. Like a lot of other golden ages that we're going to study, they also made math class way harder for y'all. So apologies on behalf of the Han. They discovered square roots, cube roots, negative numbers, the list goes on. In addition, they invested in a lot of roads and canal technology to make it easier to transport goods, to collect taxes, to communicate, to move an army. The most famous of those projects being maybe the China's Grand Canal, which is pictured in the middle of the slide. If you look at the map to the right, you will see that the Han Dynasty was huge for the time period, but also that it was surrounded by little tribes of raiding horsemen from the grasslands, people that the Han looked down on as barbarians, and people that would continue to pose problems to the empire. These would have been nomadic or semi-nomadic pastoral people from the steppes in Asia that will come back and change history, and I'm not going to give away how yet, but you will see in a couple of lessons. Oh, also though, there is that pretty big famous big wall in China called the Great Wall to keep them out with middling success.